Professor Gerald Bamberger. Today we're going to work a simulated multi-state bar examination problem in the area of criminal law. It's problem CrimLaw3. You can find it on my website, www.profbamberger.com. If you haven't already worked problem CrimLaw3, why not pause this presentation, go over to www.profbamberger.com, spend about 1 minute and 45 seconds working problem CrimLaw3, and then return and resume this presentation. Okay, I'm going to assume you've already worked problem CrimLaw3. The correct answer is choice A. Can Keg Downer properly be convicted of the murder of the firefighter? Answer yes, because arson is a dangerous felony. Keg Downer here can be convicted of felony murder where the predicate crime is the crime of arson. Now, in order to analyze this problem, we begin with the 4 mental states of crime. These come down to us through the common law. Essentially, crimes can be categorized into 4 general areas of mental state. The highest mental state requirement, in other words, the one that's most difficult for the prosecutor to prove, is specific intent. And the list of specific intent crimes will generally include the theft crimes, the inchoate crimes, and a couple of other crimes. Burglary, assault as an attempted battery. These are specific intent crimes. Next, we have the crimes of malice. There are essentially 2 malice crimes. Those are murder and arson. So in the case of arson, the prosecutor does less work than in the case of larceny. In the case of arson, the prosecutor need not prove that the defendant intended to burn a building down, merely that the defendant caused the malicious burning of the building. In other words, that the defendant was reckless, and that recklessness caused the burning of the building. Next, we have general intent and strict liability crimes. These are easier and easier for the prosecutor to prove, but we need not go into those. They're not relevant for this problem. Let's go back to specific intent crimes, where the prosecutor has to prove a specific intent on the part of the defendant. In those situations, the defendant can introduce evidence of his voluntary intoxication to the extent that that negatives the intent required to commit the crime. He may have a good defense. What am I talking about? Let's start with larceny. Let's say that the defendant is accused of stealing books at a bookstore. If the defendant can prove that he was so drunk at the time he entered the bookstore, he had no idea whether he was stealing books or he was eating eggs. If he can prove that he was that drunk, that's a good defense to the crime of larceny. It negatives the mental state requirement of specific intent. Contrast that with arson. In an arson prosecution, the prosecutor doesn't need to prove your specific intent to burn the building down. It's sufficient for the prosecutor to prove the reckless burning of the building. Now, the fact that you were voluntarily intoxicated doesn't negative that mental state of recklessness. The way I like to think of it, it was pretty reckless of you to get yourself that intoxicated in the first place. Therefore, the defense of voluntary intoxication does not work with respect to the crime of arson. So let's put together what we've got so far. Since arson is a crime of malice, and Keg Downer here obviously recklessly burned the building down. Why? Because 5 gallons of gasoline, that's a great deal of gasoline. Reckless burning of the building is arson. The only defense Keg Downer might have is his intoxication, but since arson is a crime of malice, voluntary intoxication won't be a good defense. It should be clear to you by now that Keg Downer can certainly be convicted of arson. And the question that remains is, can Keg Downer be convicted of felony murder where the predicate felony was arson? It's clear that he's committed the predicate felony. Now, with regard to felony murder, is voluntary intoxication a defense or is it not? And this is a little bit tricky. Felony murder is one of 4 varieties of murder. Let me just review that for you briefly. Murder comes in 4 flavors. Second-degree common law murder comes in 4 flavors. Intent to kill murder, intent to commit serious bodily injury murder, depraved heart murder, and felony murder. The mental state required for murder is malice. Therefore, voluntary intoxication is not a good defense to murder. However, voluntary intoxication is a good defense to felony murder if it negatives the intent requirement of the felony. What does that mean? That means if you're committing a bank robbery, someone dies as a result of that bank robbery. Is that felony murder? Answer, yes. What if you were drunk? Is it still felony murder? Answer, no, if you were drunk enough to negative the mental state requirement for robbery. If there's no felony, there's no felony murder. So that if you were drunk enough to negative the mental state requirement for robbery, you get out from under felony murder, even though felony murder is a crime of malice. Here, however, the predicate felony is arson. That predicate felony is itself a malice crime. So your voluntary intoxication doesn't negative the mental state requirement for arson. It therefore doesn't negative the mental state requirement for felony murder. Let's look at the incorrect answers. Choice B. Choice B says Keg Downer can be convicted of the murder of the firefighter because Keg Downer acted with a depraved heart. Remember, depraved heart murder was, I think, number 3 in my list of 4 types of murder. But depraved heart murder is a special type of murder that requires a very high risk of danger to human life. Now, if a person is going to burn a pile of leaves with 5 gallons of gasoline, if the building is an apartment building with people living in it, clearly that would be enough for a depraved heart murder. Why? Because there's a very high risk of danger to human life. Here, Keg Downer has lit a pile of leaves not next to any inhabited building. This building is a storage building. That's significant. If this building were a building in which people were living, then depraved heart murder would work. Depraved heart murder doesn't work here because there isn't a high risk, an extremely high risk of danger to human life. So we can't convict Keg Downer of depraved heart murder here. We can convict him of felony murder based on the predicate felony of arson. Notice, by the way, that voluntary intoxication would not be a defense to depraved heart murder if the facts were an apartment building instead of a storage facility. Let's look at choice C. Choice C says, can he be convicted of the murder of the firefighter? Answer, no, if Keg Downer was so drunk that he could not consciously disregard the risk. Conscious disregard of a risk is the act of recklessness. As we've said before, voluntary intoxication does not negative this mental state, malice or recklessness. Voluntary intoxication doesn't come in to negative the mental state. Why? Because you consciously disregarded a risk, if you will, by getting drunk in the first place. So that doesn't negative your later conscious disregard of risks. Choice D says, no, Keg Downer can't be convicted because the firefighter came to the scene after Keg Downer's crime was completed. Now, the crime of arson was completed at the time that the building started burning. However, as long as the building is burning, the crime continues for the purpose of felony murder. Again, when you have a firefighter coming to a fire, that's a foreseeable result. The firefighter isn't generally going to get there before the fire starts. The firefighter is going to get there while the building is burning. If the firefighter is going to lose his life as a result of your felony, that's felony murder, and you can't be heard to argue the felony was completed when the fire started. If you're going to go and commit a felony, do it in a way that's safe for firefighters. And if you're not going to do it in a way that's safe for firefighters, the fact that the firefighter dies after the arson is completed, that's not going to get you off the hook.